go ahead and get started.
We have 12 folks. That's enough.
Well, let's see. What time is it now? It's just now 11. Just now 11. Let's give people another couple of minutes.
Yeah, Greg, can I make an announcement here now that we're recording?
Sure, go ahead.
So remember when on Monday when we were recording Casper stand-up and I kept dropping out?
Mm-hmm.
And the call actually ended for a second. So I have the recording. I'm going to have to cut it up because there's so many points where I dropped. But the Casper stand-up from Monday hasn't been posted yet. So I just want to make that publicly known to everybody here because we will be talking about Casper today, correct?
Yeah.
It's in some regard. Yeah, okay. So I'm just pointing it out. So if you try to refer to anything that was recorded on Monday, there may be some bits that are choppy or lost. But nonetheless, I'll do my best to cut everything up and post it as soon as I get back to Seattle.
Sure. Thank you, Christian. Appreciate that. So I have some nice brain candy also that I can talk about while we're waiting. I'm currently working on a document. Yeah, I'll just dive in briefly here.
You get to share your screen?
Yeah, I'm just looking for the right. There we go. Okay, there's that one, and then and go. There we go. Yeah, I'll just do a little bit of brain candy, and that'll give people a chance to go into the room, and then we can do the technical update. So it turns out that we have a bunch of different groups that are all converging on this issue of identity, and in particular how self-sovereign identity relates to the notions, the very practical notions of identity that we want to establish on-chain, so that by next October we can be conducting on-chain voting. And we've got people like Mycelia working on a notion of identity, so that artists can be fairly remunerated as their work is both disseminated and also incorporated and mixed and remixed in other works. And likewise, we have the Life ID Foundation, which is working on a notion of identity, and we have RChain Europe, which is tasked with the expression of will and sentiment, which is fundamentally based upon a notion of identity. So we have all these groups that we're engaged with directly, that all are developing a notion of identity. And I've been thinking about a notion of identity since about 2008, when I was approached by an entrepreneur who wanted to go after the self-sovereign identity idea, and had some good insights about that you didn't have to have one notion of identity. So we were able to render that in math, and so let me talk a little bit about that, just really briefly. In the world of blockchain and online world, we can, when we're talking about identity that's related to online identity, and especially in the blockchain world, what we're really talking about is agency that uses communication acts across channels. So channels can be things like phone numbers or email addresses. They can also be addresses on the blockchain. And we expect in general that agents can respond across a range of channels. So a really good example that is a generalization of 2FA and other kinds of identity have to do with the ability to echo. So Morty would like to be able to send a text to Rick and have Rick send an email back to Morty, and the contents of the email exactly match the text that Rick sent out. And we see those kinds of challenges in the internet today all the time, right? And similarly, a CAPTCHA involves a generalization of this that's about paraphrasing. So here's another example that's not CAPTCHA based, but is similar in spirit. Rick sends some number of tokens to Morty, could be, dust level of tokens, and then expects Morty to be able to text back the number of tokens, right? So it's the fact that they share a range of channels in common, and they might even have a kind of channel dancing protocol between them to identify various pairs or sequences of channels. But this helps Rick and Morty feel like they are in fact talking to the right people, even though it's all over channels which don't uniquely identify those people. And then with the notion of self-sovereign identity, we also want to be able to make claims, right? So you want to be able to claim that, for example, Summer would like to be able to claim that she saw Rick at the Council of Ricks before the collapse of the Galactic Federation, right? So that names a time and a place when Summer saw Rick. And then she might want to be able to say that she saw Rick texting Morty, right? So these are claims about claims, and you want to be able to provide a system that makes it easy to talk about those kinds of things. It turns out that you can, and Rolang and the row calculus makes this pretty easy. Let me just show a couple of quick examples, then we'll get over to the technical update. So let's see. So here's one. So we have Morty texting a message to Rick, right? And now let's say, just for purposes of discussion, that Morty actually is not a single agent, and this is true of human beings as well as organizations, right? That the brain itself is organized in terms of multiple layers, and is also so that the cerebellum is a layer above the regions of the brain that are associated with emotional processing, which is a layer above the regions of the brain that are associated with sort of core or primitive movement, right? So you have sort of three basic layers to the brain, and then the brain is also bicameral. So inside human beings, we find that there is a multiplicity of agency, as well as what appears on the surface to be a single individual. But certainly in the internet, we can never really be assured that you have singularity of agency, right? So any particular person or an entity that you're engaged with might in fact be a gaggle of entities, like a bunch of bots or other kinds of things. So without belaboring the point, let's just say that Morty has internal behavior that is texting behavior and other internal behavior that's emailing behavior. And the same is true for Rick. Now, the whole thing about this being able to echo back, this echo protocol, it reveals a kind of topological truth about the communication flow. So if this is Morty with his email or texting behavior and his emailing behavior, and this is Rick with his texting behavior and his emailing behavior, if Morty's emailing behavior texting behavior goes to Rick's texting behavior, if there's no connection between Rick's internal texting and his internal emailing, then the only way that message could go back would be by lucky guess, right? There's no information flow. If they're not connected, there's no information flow back. And if you make these messages of sufficient complexity, then lucky guesses just won't cut it. So what the echo protocol provides is a proof that there's a circuit, and it's not just that it's a single path, because on this on the reverse side of this, in order for Morty to be able to compare the two the results, there has to be a connection from Morty's emailing behavior to Morty's texting behavior. So what the echo protocol really does is it shows that there's a circuit. Now, that's not sufficient to eliminate man in the middle. You could still have a man in the middle attack that participated in the circuit. But if you have a sufficient number of channels, like not just texting and emailing, but a wide range of channels, and if the protocol for switching or sequencing amongst those channels is of sufficient complexity, then you can start to get a stronger and stronger security guarantees. And this, by the way, is related to various biological protocols, such as kinetic proofreading and other kinds of things. But I won't go into that. So there's another, and by the way, just for grins, we can actually write this down in Rolang, right? So if to say that Morty is bipartite, has an emailing behavior and a texting behavior, is literally to say that Morty, which is parametric in channels for text and email, is really a parallel composition between a Morty that's engaged in text and a Morty that's engaged in email. And then to say that there must be a connection says that there has to be some channel X that is shared between the Morty texting behavior and the Morty emailing behavior. So we can literally draw this diagram in terms of a bunch of parallel compositions. So the same is true, that what we just reasoned about for Morty, there's a symmetric reasoning for Rick, and then the complete system is really just a parallel composition of these two behaviors here. Now the point that I was making about the man in the middle of the tag is actually kind of easy to see as well. And the reason is because every channel can be turned into a process, right? So P can talk to Q only if they share at least one channel. But notice that we can implement this kind of arrangement by having P parametric in both X and Z, and it shares Z with some process C. And likewise, Q is parametric in both W and Y, and Q shares the channel W with C. So now C is implementing this singular channel that we had here. And that can be quite innocuous. For example, this is more or less the way the internet works today with TCP. This channel process is what's called the high watermark protocol, and it guarantees exactly once in order delivery. So some of these things can be innocuous, but there's no guarantee that these things are innocuous. They could masquerade as innocuous or benign processes and actually do all kinds of nefarious things. And it's also important to note that if we can do it once, like this, then we can iterate. So you could do the same thing with Z and W and so on and so forth. So you can literally extend this channel out ad infinitum, and that's more or less what's really happening when you use your browser. You have many, many, many channels between one endpoint and another. And notice how simple it is to write it down in Rolang. And in particular, if we look here, the probe that Morty would like to issue with respect to Rick is represented this way. So we wait on email for a message, and we need to check that that message matches the one that we sent. And if it does, then we run our success behavior. So we make this parametric in a success and a failure behavior. And if it doesn't match, then we run our failure behavior. And all of that is running in parallel with sending the initial message on the text channel. So again, it's a very, very simple, very, very straightforward piece of Rolang code that represents the kind of probe that that Morty would issue for an echo test. And more generally, we can characterize the loop in this way. So there's a lot more to this, but I've already taken up way too much time, and we probably have plenty of people here to now go into the status update. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Ned.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to be doing the community tech update today, and let me share my screen. And you could all see my screen, hopefully, and I will, here's a link to the document that I will post in the chat window. So you can, everybody can follow along at home. All right, so Kelly and Deanna are not available today, so I'm going to go through the release. So we've released our node .8.1. And you can see the release plan here. We have one big thing is there's an upgrade to Java 10 if you want to run our node. We have made some improved debugging on consensus, and I'll get more details overview style when we go back, but just want to show you that there is a tremendous amount of work in this .8 release, and kudos all around to the core dev team for really chugging through this and getting, you know, all this code done. And I will let you all read through this, you know, on your own. Feel free to reach out at any time if you have any questions, but there's a lot in this release. If we go back to the update, so where's Testnet? So we are making progress in tracking down the problems with keeping Testnet up and running. The developers have their own developer testnet that they have running for debugging support. We're not yet ready to release that out to the general public, and that was why we canceled the Tuesday testing session yesterday. But we are focusing in on that and are making progress, and we'll keep you updated on that. Okay, you can view the issues at the link here, so you can all take a look at that. I can't remember, one of the devs recommended using this tool, which is a tool that helps us visualize the blockchain at any point, and you pass in a text file, you pass it into this Graphviz, and it creates an image like this, and it makes it really easy to visualize graphically what the blockchain looks like. So that's going to be a real big help for debugging. And you'll see this actually the next line throughout, which is that we are focused on fixing testnet and platform stability. So stability right now is the #1 priority. We are continuing to work on Mercury requirements and acceptance criteria. We have a bunch of requirements already done, and what we've been doing as things are done, we've been turning them over to the dev team, and the dev team is then going through and writing the acceptance criteria and helping to flesh out the use cases as these things are ready. I also want to mention that the dev team created this function feature requirement file on GitHub, and they've hooked it up into some code they wrote for the continuous integration, and we're planning to use that feature.md document to drive the continuous integration testing. So that's going to be a big help. Okay. So let's see. So that's that. White block. So white block has made good progress in terms of setting up this shard in the box, and we are now waiting for them to hand it over to the dev team so we can actually start using it as one of our testing resources. Okay, moving on. The rolling team continues to work on stability and other bugs. So in general, I actually should say that we've taken a step back in terms of implementing any new features at the moment, and the top priorities are definitely stability and bug fixing. Okay, the Casper team has also been focused on stability, and you know, one issue we had with some of the departures was how to reseed Casper knowledge on the entire team, and Kent's been doing a great job taking a lead role in that, and he met with the other core dev team members last week and started doing knowledge shares, and we need as many of the core dev teams to understand what's going on deeply inside of Casper so they can help with all the Casper related work that's going to be coming up. Okay, Node team also working on platform stability, and they're working with the SRE team to improve metrics and monitoring to assist in platform debugging. We did find one bug, and we're in progress of fixing it in the Cadelia layer. Storage team, again, stability, and we're starting discussions up on the peak prototype. The SRE team, as I mentioned, they made significant progress working on the continuous improvement processes. We've implemented something called BORs, and BORs will give us support for timing of the continuous integration relative to the opening, review, approval, and requests that come into GitHub. And it's already proving to be a big productivity boost. And let's see, the developer website, let's see, we know the dev website has not been updated for a bit, and we're waiting for some resources to come available so we can update it with the release of 8.1 and the Rev issuance page. Which actually, I guess I should spotlight, the Rev issuance page no longer reflects the current timeline for the Mercury release. So we do need to update that at some point soon. Let's see, and I think that's it for the tech update. Does anybody have any questions?
Hey Ned, it's Ed.
Hey Ed.
Hi, thanks for the update, and definitely appreciate the team's focus on stability and testnet. You know, it's absolutely the right focus. I was curious if you could summarize, or maybe we could queue up this conversation for later, how the dev team views the technical risks for Mercury. You know, I could surmise kind of a list. I know there's, you know, obviously things underneath why testnet is a challenge at the moment. But do you have such a list, or has that been discussed within the dev team?
Actually, Ed, I can take this one.
Awesome.
So the first thing I did right before we brought the team in-house was to have Kent and some others draw up a kind of technical risk matrix. And now we're tracking that against the next effort, which was the MVP requirements. So when the MVP requirements are completed, we should be able to have a detailed assessment of what the risks are relative to feature complete against all the MVPs. And at that point, once we have that, then we have a much more objective way to say what the timeline is. So, you know, essentially what we're hitting right now is there wasn't a lot of testing done as a part of development up to the point when we brought the team in-house. And so we're uncovering all of the stability issues that were latent before. So, you know, now we're just taking those on and getting to the next stable point. So you could think of node 8 as essentially a stability release. And that's a priority 1, severity 1, above feature work until we hit the kind of stability that we want to see.
No, I really appreciate that, and I know that that's been challenging for the community to see what apparently looks like a slowdown of progress when a lot of what's going on is addressing bugs and performance issues that have been there all along. So yeah. I really do appreciate that. But what I would like to see is you know, sort of where the big rocks from a technical challenge are between here and Mercury. I understand the feature list pretty well. I haven't been part of those discussions, but I don't know, for example, if, you know, comms, consensus, other garbage collection, or some of these other types of categories are risks. And it'd be great in the coming weeks to hear more about the technical challenges in front of us.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I can say is comms feels a little bit more settled, and we're not seeing quite as much in the way of issues with comms, and that's being exercised most essentially as we're doing these multi-node tests, right? The comms is not showing itself to be a source of features, right? The biggest source of risk, and similarly for Rolang, we're not seeing a lot of issues with Rolang. It's I mean, there's some features we'd like to develop, but they're not actually necessary to give coverage, with the exception of one. There's no feature that I'm aware of that's necessary to give coverage for the Rolang implementation necessary to get Casper out the door, as an example. So Rolang and comms seem to be more settled down. Casper and RSpace are the places where we have the biggest sort of high-level risks. So RSpace, it's mostly about performance, not about stability. And Casper is mostly about stability at this point. And then after we get stability, then we can start looking at performance and features. The other big risk factor is just making sure that the cost accounting gets completed. You know, we had that work was supposed to be in hand, and we lost that resource. And the project wasn't organized in such a way that you know, if we, you know, that major features were tag teamed. So this had been my request for quite some time, and continues to be how I like to do things, is that major features need to be tag teamed, and we need to have a lot more cross feature communication rather than siloed. Yeah, I mean, in general, I just don't, for small projects and startups, I don't believe in the siloed approach. I think it's very, very dangerous. And now we're seeing some of the consequences of a concerted effort towards a siloing in feature development.
Integrate early and often, right?
Absolutely. You need sharing across the teams, because, you know, I mean, like in the world where software is as hot as it is today, you know, any crack developer can get a bug, you know, up their rear end and say, oh, I want to go off and do this other thing. Hey, I want to go work on this quantum computing stuff. Whatever it is, they could just, and so you need to be prepared that this could happen at any time. And that's why tag teaming and integration is a much better approach.
Yeah, and then another question area, either Greg or for Ned, is around the area of command line wallets and the early wallet work. I know that Dan Connolly has been working on you know, some relatively simple scenarios. You know, Alice pays Bob, and enabling, you know, the Ethereum style of signature signing, and some other things in that area, and it's very challenging. And I was also hoping for some progress and updates on the command line wallet work, which Ned, you didn't happen to mention. So could one of you comment on the next steps there?
Yeah, so, you know, that's a good point. So Ed, you know, we've been including you in all our wallet discussions, and, you know, we really need you to keep putting the pedal to the metal, so to speak. You know, as I said before, we're not focused on new features. We're still focused on stability and performance. But I know that the command line wallet is on the list of a mainnet requirement. So it's on the list. And
actually, I have a little bit more detail.
Sure.
So I met with Kayvon while I was down in San Francisco this week. And one of the things we talked about, because Kayvon's been working with Ed,
right,
on going through the requirements document and then relating that to what Dan Connolly has already done.
Right.
And Kayvon believes that there's actually a very small gap in terms of what you'd like to see versus what's done, and that there's just a little bit of stitching work to be done here. And so we're just figuring out what the right way to resource that is. Whether we could have give just a little bit of support to Dan and have that be finished off that way, or if Kayvon needs to take a more active role. But it's essentially Kayvon has done a gap analysis to the best of my understanding, and feels that it's not a major chunk of work. In other words, it doesn't require a lot of big gun to get this completed. So we're just now trying to figure out the best way to resource that.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know that conversation happened. It's moving ahead. There's in addition to basic wallet, the co-op will need a multi-sig wallet at launch time as well. So
Agreed.
there's work ahead. So thanks for the update.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, along those lines, sort of, it's funny, when it rains, it pours. It turns out we've got, so the segue here is resourcing. It turns out we've got room in the budget now for about 5 developers. And in the space of 24 hours, I literally had 2 development groups across my desk, and we're setting up technical interviews with one and beginning the conversation to do that with another group. So we should be bringing on an additional 5 developers into the mix to help accelerate Mercury. So we're to bring the mainnet timeframes in. So we're looking at accelerating that both by adding additional dev resources and also by using the white block technology in some innovative ways. So I feel really, really good about, again, it's that kind of thing. Like, a month ago we really needed to find a better solution for launching mainnet in terms of the overall cost to validators, and white block just magically appeared. And literally, we identified that we had room for 5 dev in the budget, and within a day, I was talking to 2 different dev groups. So we're the universe is continuing to help us out here. But we'll have more on that as we set up these technical interview loops. Let's see. What else do we have to talk about? So there's some work I'd like to talk about with respect to Casper. That's pretty technically involved. So before we get there, let's see if there are any other things that folks want to address before we dive into this recent discussion about Casper and Liveness.
I'll jump in briefly. I'll address Ned's question or comment about the developer site, just so everyone is aware, and I've posted about this, that as we were moving servers from all of our web properties off Pyrofex, Kayvon created this really elegant and articulate system for us to update, but there's been some problems getting security certifications. This migration is not my wheelhouse, but I'm just relaying what I know. And so basically we haven't been able to get all of the sites over. We have to do it all at once, and because of some of the problems with the blog and WordPress, we haven't been able to. So Ned, in terms of the developer site, as soon as we get everything over, and that hopefully will happen today or in the next day, Ian and Kayvon have been working many late nights on this. We'll be able to update all of our web properties, and the 3 of us are working to get that done. I'll leave it also that Kelly had mentioned that there is going to be a node release document presented, and so I have access to the Medium page. Some people on Discord have requested that we use Medium more often, so I'm going to be posting on the blog, and I'm going to be utilizing the Medium page more often. So as soon as I get that release document from Kelly about the new node, I will post it on Medium and then the blog. And then, as I said, hopefully in the next day or 2, we'll have access to all the websites. And I know people have been reaching out to me about updating, and we'll be able to get the developer site updated as soon as all that happens.
Yeah, I thank you.
I appreciate the update.
Yeah, thank you so much for the update. I also want to say that, again, as with a lot of the things that have happened in this transition, we discovered that there were a lot of warts kind of behind the scenes on the web properties. And the architecture that we've got now for our web properties is considerably better. I would really recommend that anybody who wants to gauge the improvement of the project in the last few weeks, just, if nothing else, go look at the significant upgrade to the web properties associated with the project. vastly superior, much more maintainable, much more modern architecture. And again, I see it as a dramatic improvement that allows us to cut costs while at the same time considerably extending the range of things that we can be delivering via our web properties.
Yeah,
With that,
I agree. I mean, that's completely true, Greg. And it's from a back end perspective, all of us who work on it, it just makes everything come together and cohere in a way. It was very scattered before, so that's completely true.
Yeah. So it was a very, very positive shift. And speaking of shifts, Kenny, are you ready to give an update? Give us a report card?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Yeah, it should be pretty quick because I do want to get into this Casper discussion too, since it did come up today or this week. So today, just quick updates on end of year tax preparations. So this is for if anybody on this call or watching this received any kind of payment from the co-op and hasn't, or if you don't remember submitting a 1099, this would be for Americans specifically, please do that. We're pretty sure we've got everybody, but we just want to send out a kind of all points bulletin so everybody hears that, because we do need to have our tax documents ready to go for the end of the year. So an update on IOB3, which is our conflict of interest policy. Most of the board has submitted their disclosures. We just have 2 outstanding board members that still need to submit, but as soon as we do have that, we'll have the entire board submitting conflict of interest policies. Update on IOBs. So the participation and membership is still sort of, well, we have a pretty great working draft, but we are waiting on some governance committee stuff before we can make further progress. We did have some progress on the monetary policy. So we had some user stories created for the different user groups for the Mint contract specifically. And there'll be a meeting later today to go over some of these things and further define what the Mint functions should be and how they should be operating. So do look for that in the coming days here or weeks. The RChain improvement process still is in a sort of draft form. It's a pretty well-defined draft, so I don't think it's actually, it's in a good spot right now, but it still needs some continual movement. So that's the current to-do. On the governance committee, so we're currently, right now, I've suggested that we go with a 7-member committee. I haven't heard any other feedback besides that, but it had to be between 5 and 9. I think 7 is a pretty good number, and we currently have 6 volunteers. So the list of volunteers are here. If you would like to volunteer or put your name forward for this committee, you can put that in the governance channel on Discord, and we'll go ahead and put your name on the list for people that are interested. And then as soon as that does come together, the draft charter will be finalized and put before the board with a full member list for the next board meeting for final approval before the governance committee can start doing its work next year. The unofficial minutes have been posted to GitHub from the last board meeting. And again, just to familiarize everyone with the process, within about 5 days or so, the board is putting forth unofficial minutes. So these are minutes that could be corrected. And as soon as they are officially approved, then they become final, and they can be referenced from each board's minutes as they go along. The next board meeting is technically scheduled for January 1st. I'm not sure if we're going to actually have it on the 1st, or if we might bump it one day to the 2nd, since January 1st is a holiday. And then the 4th quarter compilations will be coming out in January, I believe. But I do have some discussions further with Hunt Jackson, who will be doing our compilation report. And if there's any considerations that need to be made, I'll make sure to let the community know as soon as possible. And these are up on the blog, I think, already. So yeah, if there are any questions there, please go ahead and let me know.
Awesome. Thank you for that update, Kenny. I really appreciate it. Yeah, we should probably bump that board meeting to the, to the 2nd. Yeah, it's a good idea.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So with that, let me jump over to the Casper discussion. Hang on a second, just bringing up the right document. Okay, all right. So to set the context, the Pyrofex released a sort of critique of Casper, and I don't know if people have watched the Twitter feed. But the critique is a little bit, how do I say it? It's a little misguided. The truth is that over a year ago at the first RChain developer retreat, we explained exactly the critique that they levied to all of the developers at the retreat, including the people who published the report, with the exception of one, Derek, who was hired later. And this has to do with the fact that Casper, the Casper specification does a divide and conquer approach. So the divide and conquer approach is, first, let's reason about safety. And so Casper has a really nice approach to safety. And then let's reason about liveness. And the notion of liveness is constrained by a result that goes back over 30 years, and that's FLP impossibility. So FLP are the first letters of the names of the authors who published the very famous paper. And essentially that famous paper says that if you have no synchrony guarantees, in other words, you can have arbitrary delays on messages, or messages can even be dropped, then you can't achieve consensus, because you can always get the system into a bipartite state where some portion of the network thinks the value is one thing, and another portion of the network that is effectively disconnected thinks that the consensus value is a different value. To get around this, you have to impose certain kinds of synchrony guarantees. And those synchrony guarantees end up meaning that there's the possibility. So this puts bounds on delays for messages, or other kinds of bounds in terms of the connectivity of the message passing, the space of message passing behaviors. But those bounds means that you can get lockups. So a really good example of a protocol that gets lockups was the early Tendermint protocols. So there the validators can get into a place where they're stuck. And when you get into a place they're stuck, you kind of have to reboot the protocol you have to have some extra protocol mechanism whereby you reboot the consensus round in some way, shape, or form. So that's the kind of the Scylla and the Charybdis between which all consensus protocols have to navigate. And one of the things that's really important to understand is that if you look at the two options, there's an important economic consequence of straying too far to one extreme versus straying too far to the other extreme. So if you stray too far in the extreme of lockups, what that means is that a small group of validators, or a potentially small group of validators, can hold the network hostage. They can sort of, prevent consensus from happening because of these lockups. And the other approach, where you stray towards more in the direction of this disconnection, what that is called is a fork. And if you look at the economic consequences of a fork, that's not nearly as bad, and we've actually seen that kind of behavior in the wild now. So the forking of networks turns out not to be an economic burden, but rather an economic boon in many cases. So in particular, most networks don't want to lose the network effects of being able to talk to the other networks. So you can imagine that a fork arises. The networks essentially establish that there is a fork, and then you allow for the rejoining of these fork networks somewhere in the future with some kind of exchange between the two different, the now effectively two different token systems. And by the way, this is how nature navigates this fact of consensus in the actual wild. As a beekeeper, I can tell you that beehives fork. What really happens is that the the situation is the queen is going around. The hive is constantly promoting potential new queens, and the queen of the hive goes around and eats these potential competitors until the hive is so large that she can't get to one. And that one is promoted, and when she gets to maturity, she takes about 10,000 of the bees in the hive, roughly 1/5, 1/6 to 1/5 of the hive, and goes off, and that's a fork of the hive. But the truth is that at least at the genetic level, those hives become rejoined, because during the summers, the queens all take a flight, and they are impregnated by the drones of all the hives in the area. So at a genetic level, at a minimum, the hives are rejoined. In RChain, one of the reasons that we've always said that we're protected against forks, because you can simply remount the forks as additional namespaces or additional shards within the system. And we believe that that's the right model. It supports interoperability and protects in the way that nature does against these kinds of zero-sum situations, which is where the real issue is. It's not about zero-sum. It's about continuing to be able to work together even though we have differences. So with that said, if you look at the analysis that Pyrofex provides, it's a very similar kind of analysis, but what Vlad and I have been doing is slowly coming to our own sort of consensus about the language in which to write down the synchrony constraints. So let me give a simple example of what I mean. So again, using our Rick and Morty situation. So let's imagine that Rick and Morty are both validators in a larger network of validators, where they represent some population of validators. Now, the Pyrofex example is essentially like this. You have a justification structure where Rick starts off sending a message to Morty that is grounded here at Rick. There's no further justification for that message. And then Morty responds with a proposal this way. And similarly, Rick responds with a proposal this way. At the same time, concurrently, Morty sends off a message with a proposal for the consensus value. Rick sees it and then makes a proposal. And now you can see just from the graphics that the justification structures, right? So at each point, you can flow back in time because each message carries its history of justifications. So from this point here, we can see that the ground of the justification structure is just one validator. Likewise for the black chain, the ground of the justification structure is just one validator. In other words, what we're seeing is a replication of this bipartiteness. The justification structures are disconnected, right? And well, what one needs to do to prevent this kind of thing is to establish some connection. So if you had a connection that also connected the red to the black, so if there was an additional message, say from Rick, that connected the red to the black, then the ghost calculation would select a winner in the race. And the reason it's not selecting a winner is because of this disconnectedness. So the general way to think about these synchrony constraints is you can generalize this kind of disconnectedness to lots of, like, think about them as sort of braided strands, right? If you have lots of braided strands that can effectively be disconnected into a smaller support. And the important thing about support is it doesn't have to be grounded out at the Genesis block. Here, we're grounding at the Genesis block, but this could just as easily be the last finalized block. So just from a graphics perspective, or graphical intuitions about how to think about these synchrony constraints, what they end up doing is being up to some notion of fault tolerance. They're a kind of wave across the diagram, which connects the diagram not just vertically, but also horizontally. There are lots of different ways in which to express these. But just, so Casper is parametric in the estimator, right? It doesn't have to use, Ghost, it can use lots of rules. But Ghost, in particular, as an estimator, requires an expression of these synchrony constraints that have to do with these connections across. And it's also important to understand that these connections across can overlap, right? So you can have a wave of connections across that go this way, say like, earlier in time for Rick, earlier in time for Morty, later in time for Summer, later in time for Beth, and so on. And they could also go the other way, earlier in time for Jerry and Beth, and then later in time for Summer, Morty, and Rick. And the only thing that's required in order to actually get safety, liveness, is that you have these series of barriers. And literally, graphically, you can think of these as like synchronization barriers that you find in hardware design. It's a very similar kind of thing. The work that I've been doing here, which is all about really the paying off in terms of correct by construction, is getting the entire Casper protocol, including the message justification structure, expressed in Rolang. And what that means is that once we have all of that, here's a simple calculation which will provide an interpretation of the message structure as a Rolang term. Here's a simple example of how this is done. I think I've walked through this before, so I won't go into it in detail. Here's a single message. If you write down the calculation of this message using that formula, you'll get a Rolang term. If you interpret the message as a ping pong diagram like this one, or an interaction diagram, and then there's a general formula that goes from interaction diagrams to Rolang terms. If you run that calculation either way, either direct from message to Rolang term, or from message to interaction diagram and then to Rolang term, the two Rolang terms are bisimilar. So that proves that this is kind of the unique or the simplest or most information preserving encoding. Once you have those kinds of things, then you can write down these synchronization constraints that are all about these connectivities across the diagram in a couple of different ways. But in particular, we don't have to commit to mechanism too early because we can write down these constraints about being connected across in terms of the spatial behavioral types, which is a big win for us, because then that gives us a wide range of implementation techniques and allows us to optimize as time goes on, and yet still prove liveness. So that's the real that's the game that Vlad and I have been working on, and it was always by design, right? I mean, we started with safety, and if you don't make these synchronization constraint assumptions, you won't have a live protocol. It's only if you put in the synchronization constraint assumptions that you get a live protocol. And the most important thing is what is the language for putting in the synchronization constraint assumptions? And I've laid out for you, at least for RChain, the language for doing that. And I've also laid out for you the basic geometric or topological intuitions as to how this works. So you don't have to dive into the heavy math calculations like these in order to see for yourself or convince yourself what's actually going on in terms of how Liveness works. So let me stop there. That gives us about 5 minutes for questions. Okay. Did people see the screen share?
Oh yeah, sure.
Cool. All right.
Hey, this is Chris. I have a question, Greg. Sorry, I was on mute, which is
No
why you
worries.
didn't hear it. So, the constraints for, or the, I guess, implementation of the constraints for synchronizing that you talked about, are those going to be available when mainnet launches, or is?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we will absolutely have those. I mean, and they're very. The important thing is that with our methodology, it's not just that we'll have these synchronization constraint mechanisms, but that the mechanisms will satisfy the synchronization constraint properties. Right. So we're proceeding in this disciplined fashion from a crisp statement of what the properties are, where we can effect a real liveness proof, to code that provably implements those properties. So that's why we're proceeding this style. And most of what I'm trying to do here is to provide a communication mechanism whereby people can just visually see what the problem is, right? You can just see with your eyes what's going wrong, why it's wrong, right? And you can see what it is in the justification structure that is allowing for something to go wrong, and what you have to add to the justification structure to fix it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Good. Wonderful.
Now, if the liveness issue comes out from is due to double spend attacks, couldn't double spend be sanctioned in some way?
No, double spend is not where liveness comes from. You can get a disagreement. You can get a disagreement that would result potentially in a double spend if you didn't have a live protocol, right? But if the protocol is live, then there will be there won't be any double spend, and you'll reach a state where all the enough validators up to your fault tolerance agree on what the outcome is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in the article they were saying that in order for there to be liveness, that Casper was assuming never mind. I think you answered it.
Yeah. Basically, in order for there to be liveness, I mean, the crisp topological way to think about this, in order for there to be liveness, you can't separate the space into two spaces. There has to be a path across enough of the space. And the reason I don't say the entire space is because we're admitting faults, right? So up to some Byzantine faults, and those Byzantine faults can represent holes in the space, right? So that's what's going on. And so what we want to do is to have a protocol that's sufficiently relaxed that we can account for these Byzantine faults, or some number of these Byzantine faults. If we were to say that the space had to be totally connected, then that would be equivalent to saying that there are no Byzantine faults.
So non-technical question, are there any plans to publish sort of a rebuttal to what's been said about the liveness of Casper CBC as implemented by RChain?
Yeah, of course. But first of all, I don't feel particularly, there's already been a rebuttal, I think, what, a truth teller or something, rebutted it on Twitter. I don't feel any particular pressure. Mike and I spoke about it yesterday, or Monday, I think it was. And I just reminded him of the example, and he said, "Oh yeah, I vaguely recall that." So, but I also think that, there's just a lot of, how do I say, kind of marketeering going on. I mean, if Mike and Kyle really felt that there were problems, they could have come and talked to us at the Casper stand-up. It's not like they don't know where we're having those conversations or when we're having them. I think this is mostly just kind of, how do I get my archive paper to have the most hits on it? But the rebuttal is extremely straightforward, and I just want to be able to write it down in a way that we can code it up in the spatial logic model checker as an example, and get a proof of the liveness, so that there isn't a lot of argumentation about it, because the proof is automated.
Well, it will be automated, I think.
Yeah, but the thing is, I can get to a proof of liveness, like following the methodology that I sketched out here. I can get to a proof of liveness without an implementation of Venus features, just by using one of the existing model checkers. And that's so that is automated. It's just not that proof won't be directly connected to Rowline code, right? It'll be connected to terms that are reminiscent of Rowline terms, but are not exactly Rowline terms. When we have our spatial type system, then the proof will correspond to the fact that the Rowline code type checks.
Thank you.
Sure, of course. Now let's see. There's a couple of questions here. I'm actually late for a meeting. Let's see. So what I'll do is, if people want to take this offline, we can have a deeper conversation on each of these things. But I'm running a bit late, so I will I'll set up a time if people want to go a little bit deeper, and we can have that conversation. With that, I'm going to jump over to another meeting. But thanks to everyone for another excellent Hangout. Talk to you soon.